All right,
Let's do this.
ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this month's evidence-based esports. This month we are talking particularly about keyboards. So sorry to the console-only gamers out there. This one is slightly less for you than usual, but hey, who knows? Maybe you play PC games too. PC Master Race. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to dive right into it with. Everybody knows the standard keyboard setup. Big, flat, rectangular-ish thing. Sometimes more oblong than rectangular, but it looks like this, and your hands go like this, and et cetera, et cetera. Hasn't changed in ages. There is, however, a more novel approach to keyboards, and this is not just in gaming. This is even more so in the workplace, because workplace ergonomics matter too. But a split keyboard, which is it splits down the middle of a standard keyboard, so not including your number pad on the side, but in the middle of your QWERTY, it splits. And so there was an article we looked at that compared the risk of injury with a standard keyboard versus three other configurations of a split keyboard. So the first configuration had the halves of the keyboard 20 centimeters apart, which is like not that far for us American viewers. It's tiny. They're still pretty close. It's almost like a standard keyboard, only slightly farther apart. The second configuration was half the width of the shoulders, so about here. Sorry, there's my hands. There we go. And then the third configuration was the width of the shoulders. So the important thing to note about the final two of these is that these are more adjustable to the size of the person using them than just the standard 20 centimeter measurement in the middle. That's also really important to note because a standard keyboard is designed to be used by somebody whose hands are as small as mine or as large as, I don't know. Do you have bigger hands than me? You probably
Fine.
do. Yeah, that size. That's there we go. That size. Uh, so obviously that isn't too customizable. Whereas maybe using a split keyboard, you could arrange things a little more optimally for yourself. So they looked at typing over the course of a day. They looked at productivity in terms of the efficiency of typing. They looked at self-reported exertion and self-reported pain. They also measured, using a really cool metric, the amount of force applied over the wrist, which is important because the more force is applied, the more chance you have of injury, generally. That's really generally, actually. All right, so looking at those metrics, first of all, one of the things they looked at was wrist ulnar deviation. So here's your wrist. Ulnar deviation is your wrist bending this way. So we see that a lot with. All right, here's our console reference for the show. We see that a lot with if you're playing with your GameCube controller and your wrists start tilting down, you get more of that pressure here. But you can also see that with a standard keyboard, right? Because if you're sitting like this and your keyboard's in the middle and you need to be able to reach all of your keys squarely in front of you, you can see it on my hands right now. They are turning out. So that's ulnar deviation. That's turning out to the side.
Okay, no,
You're dying.
doesn't work. Doesn't work.
It was
Work.
worth a shot.
It's too close.
So the biggest thing they found that was in all split keyboard configurations, the 20 centimeters, the half the width of the shoulders, and the full shoulder width, wrist ulnar deviation was less, regardless of the configuration. The reason why that matters is that neutral wrist posture, as in not going out to the side, not going out to the side, but staying in the middle, is associated with a decreased risk of work-related musculoskeletal disorders, aka carpal tunnel, tendinopathies, things like that. And so these, for those of you who are interested in geeking out about this as much as we are, the science reason behind that is as your wrist angle approaches neutral in this plane, the net reaction forces from the carpal bones, which are the wrist bones, on the tendons and the sheaths that pass by them, that decreases, which decreases the friction applied to those surfaces, which decreases the risk of inflammation, which decreases the risk of injury. And research also shows that increased carpal tunnel pressure occurs with wrist ulnar deviation of 15 to 20 degrees relative to ulnar deviation of less than 10 degrees. So what they found in this study was that with a standard keyboard, literally everyone was over 15 to 20 degrees. And with the split keyboard, literally everyone was under 10 degrees, which is a significant difference. The next thing they measured was typing performance. Was there any difference in their productivity and their efficiency and their speed of typing? There wasn't. There was no difference whatsoever. It does not make you less efficient to use a split keyboard. This is a thing with a giant asterisk next to it when it comes to gaming, though. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And the last thing they looked at was self-reported pain. Overall, the only difference that was reported, and this was not a statistically significant difference, was less perceived neck pain with the split keyboard, and there was no difference between each configuration. So, what can we get out of this study? How does it apply to gaming? Is it useful at all for us? Because this was studied in a workplace. Um, so, the application and limitations for gaming would be thing one. And I can't believe I'm about to say this because I know this will be taken as OMG, CSGO completely sideways is totally okay. Angling keyboards a little bit is useful. Because all of the split belt setups, all the split keyboard setups, involve some angling of the keyboard, which makes sense, right? If the keyboard is not directly in front of you, you're not doing this anymore. All of a sudden, your wrists are able to be in that neutral position because the keyboard is now parallel to this plane as opposed to this plane. There we go.
Yep. Can I touch on that real quick?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. So basically, every one of the CS:GO players at CLG tilt their keyboard, and as a checkoff to make sure that they're not putting their wrist in a position that's too harmful for them or put them at a risk for injury, I have to make sure that they're straight. And just like you mentioned, when I do look at it, it's perfect. So even though it's crazy tilted all the way to the right, it's still they actually are still able to maintain their wrist in neutral, which is the most important part of this. So
Yep.
just a reminder that hey, you can tilt your keyboard or you can modify it as long as you maintain your wrist in that neutral posture that we mentioned. Right. It's okay.
And obviously, it's not just the wrist; it's all the components up the chain as well, which we talk about and harp about posture constantly. But yes, as long as it allows you to remain in neutral, we're good. So that tells us that a split keyboard may allow for a more ergonomic posture if it's aligned, possibly. However, some of the limitations when it comes to gaming are typing performance is a little bit different than gaming performance. You're not spreading out your force over a wide variety of keys with gaming. There's a couple very specific keys you're hitting. There's a limited number of them, and it's not quite the same as typing throughout the day. So the generalizability of this study to gaming is a little limited. Additionally, it really depends on what keys you're going to have to use and how much you have to move your mouse. So for example, that last configuration where the keyboards are shoulder width apart, that may force you to have a mouse outside of your comfortable neutral range of your shoulder rotation. It may not be feasible to have a right-sided split keyboard and a mouse on the right side, both in comfortable, easy ergonomic reach. But theoretically, using a split keyboard, how might we make that setup ergonomic for your standard Dota, Overwatch, or League player? And this is kind of based off of looking at standard keybinds. If you've got modified keybinds, and sorry, this may be less applicable to you. So in order to fit everything you need to appropriately, including the mouse, we'd probably use either the first or the second configuration, the one where it's either 20 centimeters apart or half the distance of the shoulder width apart. This would allow room for the mouse, because you wouldn't want that mouse to be outside your neutral range of your shoulder. It's a lot harder to have precise control of the mouse when the shoulder's not in neutral because it requires increased muscle force to maintain that same stable posture when your shoulder's externally rotated. You wouldn't need to change anything about the desk height. You'd keep it the same because you want to be in neutral both vertically and horizontally. And I see a question in chat about that. Is bending my wrists downward for my wrists bad as well? Yep. You are putting extra compression on your carpal tunnel that way. You want things to be in neutral both this way and this way. So you don't want your wrists to be bent this way or this way. You also want them to be bent this way or this way. You want them in the middle. This is all about the neutral game. That was a really bad pun.
Move your desk or move your chair, whatever you have to.
Move everything else to get you in neutral.
Keep yourself or keep your wrist in neutral.
Yep. And the other thing about the split keyboard that would be good for ergonomics when it comes to posture, those moving the keyboard apart a little bit and bringing it closer to you and in a different plane, it should reduce the amount of medial rotation you have to do at the shoulder, which would allow for decreased work by the scapular stabilizers to keep the upper back in neutral. The shoulders retracted versus rounded forward, and we talked about last month, those really important cues of that deep breath in, right? Because that's what's keeping you in that nice, stable, neutral position. You do have to let that deep breath out at some point too. That's important too. So with all that said, these are only some of the factors that impact good ergonomics in gaming. Obviously, there's a heck of a lot more than just your keyboard. There's a heck of a lot more than just the position of your wrists when it comes to how your keyboard impacts your ergonomics. So one of the factors my study focused on was the amount of force applied across the wrist due to the angle of the wrist, either here or here. But another factor to consider when it comes to forces is the force required from the muscles that control your fingers, because all of those muscles come across your wrist. So Matt had a chance to look at an article that examined the effects of force in keyboard presses.
Yep, that's right. So, for my study, as she said, it looked at key strike forces and the relationship to levels of musculoskeletal system symptoms. Basically, if you have pain in the neck or pain in the back, pain in the shoulder, those are musculoskeletal symptoms. And they looked at the relationship, again, of how hard we press our keys and then the presence of these symptoms. So we all know that with things like repetitive work or gaming or awkward postures of our trunk, neck, our arms, and improper ergonomics can all lead to the development of repetitive strain injuries. And this study wanted to look more locally at the actual keyboard. So there's already been some studies that have looked into this relationship and have identified that, hey, when we do have a higher key strike force, there's higher EMG activity of the muscles, which makes sense, obviously, right? If we're going to press it harder, our muscles are going to work harder. But they identified that the amount of force that we're using often is 2 to 7 times higher than is required to activate the key. So that's already a study that has been done. But this study wanted to look a little further into the relationship. So basically, a little background about key switches. There's something called an actuation point, and that's the actual distance where the key needs to travel before it's actually recognized by the keyboard. And then at that point, there's a actuation force. That's a force that you have to press your key for it to register. So there's two things: the distance traveled, the actuation point, and the actuation force, which is how hard you press your key to register it. So this study was a little different because it was able to measure the forces applied to a little keyboard in more of a workplace setting. A lot of the studies before were done in a lab setting, and they used a force plate underneath the actual keyboard and not within the specific keys. So this one was a little more generalizable to the rest of the working population. And they looked at 24 computer programmers and split them into two groups, 12 based on their questionnaire response. They said 12 with pain and 12 without. But the difference was that 12 of them reported three or more areas of pain, and then 12 reported three or less than three. So those are the two groups of 12. And for this study, they asked the subjects to type a predetermined text. So they didn't include the text in the study, but it utilized the keys that they were studying, which were R, C, comma, and U, a specific amount of times. I think it was 4 times through the entire text. And then they were recorded using this flexible sensor that was attached underneath the key during the typing. So what they found with this was that after all of the testing, after all the typing, there was a significant difference in the key strike forces between people who had reported high levels of musculoskeletal symptoms, and specifically in the neck and the back, compared to those who reported lower levels of musculoskeletal symptoms. Basically, the two groups. They found that, hey, the group that had three or more basically typed harder. And the actual difference was they used the force centinewtons or 0.56 newtons, which is centinewtons. And that was the group that had actual pain in their neck or in their lower back versus 42 centinewtons for people that didn't have pain. And for the neck, it was people typed with 59 centinewtons versus 40. So there's, even though it may not seem that big of a difference, it was determined as significant. So they said that, hey, there's this key difference between people who have neck pain and low back pain. And one of the reasons that they wanted to identify was how much force are they actually typing with. And that is now correlated with musculoskeletal symptoms. So their conclusion was that it's based kind of again on this theory that we discussed before about posture, that you need to have stability proximally, so kind of closer to your spine, so that it allows your arms, your elbows further down the line to be able to move or to be able to have mobility to perform any task. And they hypothesized that, hey, when you have less control here in your chest, your neck, your mid back, your low back, you will have to make more micro adjustments down the line in your shoulder, in your elbow, in your wrist that leads to increased strain in these same body regions. So basically saying again, our proximal posture is again important.
Mhm.
But it also is saying that hey, it also says that key strike forces is something that we can look into to identify or to assess as healthcare practitioners to identify a potential cause for the injury that one of you guys may be having or someone that is a computer programmer may be having. So the bottom line with all of this is that hey, more key strike forces means more musculoskeletal symptoms or pain, specifically in the neck and back. So, and for anyone that's a healthcare provider watching this, if we can assess this, we can utilize it to indicate a potential risk for injury and then inquire about the potential causes that may lead to that actual injury. So, assessing their postural control and awareness and assessing their endurance or of their distal musculature, of their fingers and their grip strength. And some of the limitations for this study was that, hey, it was kind of small. It's only 24 people that they assessed. So that's, again, has less generalizability. All the participants were computer programmers, so it may not be generalized to us who are gamers. But if we think about it in terms of APMs, computer programming compared to gaming, gaming probably has more APMs. So that in the sense of if we have more actions per minute and we're typing with higher key strike forces, technically that can lead to more overall strain. And I'll talk about that a little further with kind of a calculation I came up with.
Right.
Also, in general, only they only measured certain keys, but they thought that those keys were the most typed, most commonly typed with all the words that they were doing as computer programmers. So who knows if people type differently or basically we use different keys. WASD is going to be what we want to
Pretty
we
much.
want to
We
look
want to measure
into.
that.
So basically, the next thing I wanted to talk about was something called the performance trade-off when we're talking about ergonomics. And um, at the root of it, what it is that we often utilize keyboards, mechanical keyboards or mice, which often provide us with performance benefits. Whether it be faster response times or better DPI. But what we're trading off sometimes is a higher risk of injury. And I'll give you guys an example. So we often choose mechanical keyboards because, again, they have faster response times. They have better tactile feedback. Think of your Cherry MX switches. And then maybe cool lights. Compared to ergonomic keyboards, which are slower. They don't provide the same type of feedback. And that is important to a lot of gamers because they want to know that they're pressing the keys to activate the skill shot or hit your ultimate. But, and so, sorry, for the ergonomic keyboards, the reason that they don't have that feedback because of their membrane or silicon keyboard switches. So it's a little different. So these mechanical keyboards, like Kaylin had mentioned, often position our wrists sometimes in a little more extension if they don't have the palm support, and also a little bit of ulnar deviation. And with regards to the actual key switches, some of them have higher actuation forces. So the Cherry MX green switches versus the red, there's 80 versus 40 centinewtons. That means we have a higher risk of strain. So the trade-off is that we can have faster response times and likely better performance, but we're risking injury or have a higher risk of injury. And if we do a little calculation, let's say one of us has Cherry MX reds, 40 centinewtons. One of us has Cherry MX greens, 80 centinewtons to the amount of force that it actually takes to register the key switch. If we have 200 actions per minute, if we play for 3 hours, that's a cumulative force for the Cherry MX switches of 1,440,000. Well, yeah, 1,440,000 sort of centinewtons. And for 80 centinewtons, which is the Cherry MX green, it's double that. It's 2,880,000 centinewtons of cumulative force. So you can see that the only difference is the key switches, and you're doubling the amount of cumulative force on your actual muscles of your hands and fingers. So the good news is that, hey, we can nullify this in several ways. One is just take a little more breaks. that allows our muscles to recover a little bit, and the cumulative force is has less of an impact on our musculature. Two, we can have the better wrist position to reduce the risk of strain, so our muscles don't have to work as hard to press the keys, even at the higher actuation force. And then three, doing some maybe endurance exercises to increase the time to fatigue of these muscles and time to strain. So that's basically this performance trade-off that we can kind of consider when we have to maybe make our purchase of our new keyboard, or just realize that, hey, when we have these mechanical keyboards, let's just position our wrist better. Let's take more breaks, and let's ensure that our posture is in the right position to limit the amount of cumulative force that will happen likely with your better keyboard.
Right. And just like with traditional sports, there's going to be a trade off between what is safest and most ideal and what is the most performance a good deal of the time. They're sometimes going to match up, but not most of the time. You're going to have to find a middle ground or to commit to one or the other. So generally speaking, more forces and more actions are going to apply more stresses and have a higher risk of injury. That's not to say you immediately go out and purchase every single piece of ergonomic gear ever and decide that's the only way you're going to do it, because that may make you a less effective gamer.
Yep.
It's weighing the costs and benefits. It's weighing the risks and the rewards. So recognizing, okay, in order for me to respond quickly enough, I do need something like the Cherry MKX switches. But my trade-off is going to be that here's what I'm going to do for my postural stability. Here's the extra exercises I'm going to perform for endurance. Here's the extra attention I'm going to pay to that proximal, near to your trunk, stability to improve my distal, near to the hands, mobility. Here's the ways I'm going to compensate for the stresses I'm placing myself under. It's finding and striking that balance, and part of it is in your setup, and part of it is in how you approach your setup. The things that you do outside of just playing the game. To lower your injury risk, because there's no lowering it all the way to zero, but how can we make it less likely that we'll get injured? And so that kind of folds into. Go ahead, I saw that.
Oh no.
Go for it.
Oh yeah, there's just a question. Someone asked, would finger and wrist extension exercise help prevent injury from keyboard use? Yeah,
Yep.
it can totally do it if you do
It can, if you do them right.
in a volume. Yeah, if you do it in the right form,
Right.
one, but also in the higher amounts. You want to do it in
Right.
endurance type of loads and repetitions. So
Right.
do higher reps, sets of 15 to 20, instead of just doing sets of like
Yeah.
5 to 10.
So just like general information for those of you who aren't big into lifting, there's a difference between training for muscle volume and bulk and training for muscular endurance. So if you want to get crazy jacked, but you don't give a crap about how long your muscles last, what you want to do is do very, very high weights of low reps. So that's like the 5x5 training programs you see with starting strength and things like that. If you want to train for muscular endurance, if you want your body to, if you're, say, a marathon runner and you want your muscles to last you over the course of 26.2 miles, doing a 5x5 training program makes no sense whatsoever, because that's not what you need to do. You don't need that quick explosive force. You need things that last you for a long time. As gamers, we need muscular endurance, just, in these muscles. So what Matt was saying about doing a higher number of repetitions, that's training your hands specifically for what they're going to have to do over the course of a long period of play, which is last for a while. This chat automatically blocks links. Sorry about that. Do you suggest using a wrist rest for a mouse? Please tell me. I'm going to take your question seriously and hope that you just didn't link me one of the mouse pads that's like tits, because I've gotten that before. But generally speaking, when it comes to a wrist rest, if it is applying pressure across your carpal tunnel, which it can, that is bad. You don't want pressure here. This doesn't have much overlying it to protect the structures that go through the carpal tunnel. If you're using this, the heel of your hand, totally fine, as long as it keeps your wrist in a nice neutral position. There's not one answer for everybody. Like if I use a wrist rest for a mouse, for me, it forces me into a claw hand position. I can't do it. It's just the configuration of my hand based on the size of my hand relative to the size of my mouse. For somebody else, it might work. So the important thing is to know where your wrist should be and then structure your setup around that.
Exactly.
Speaking of structuring your setup, that was a really bad segue. I tried. All right.
Oh, that was good.
Uh,
I thought that was good.
so part of why we wanted to do this particular piece, even though keyboards are not necessarily applicable to everyone, is that we were talking about that performance trade-off, right? That ideal ergonomic versus ideal performance, and the times when you're going to have to find a balance in the middle. In the coming months, we'll be releasing a short video series, and these will be like quick little 5 to 10 minute, no longer videos. Comparing a traditional versus novel peripheral piece of gear. So looking at mechanical versus membrane keyboards, looking at standard versus split keyboards, looking at a traditional mouse versus a vertical mouse. And then last but not least, we didn't forget about consoles, looking at the GameCube controller versus something like the Smashbox or the Haxbox. Which we think will be a really cool thing to do in terms of just getting more information out there and making sure that you're making an informed choice as opposed to just picking it because it's got the prettiest lights, although I've done that too.
Yeah.
Um,
So, Dirty Harry, you asked some really great questions. I like you.
you just made Matt's day with that question. You have no
I like you a
idea.
lot. So there are a lot of different ways that you can assess this. There's the actual dynamometer, which is a device. It's like $20 on Amazon, but for us that just measures grip strength. Again, it's not a measure of endurance. So I've kind of come up with a lot of different ways that we can assess, and I use this for some of the players at CLG. But if you're at home and you just want to kind of know how much endurance you have, you can grab a lighter dumbbell, usually between 3 to 5% body weight, and do as many wrist extensions as possible. So basically, it'll look like this. Hold on. I have a dumbbell handy.
Oh, how
course.
convenient!
Oh,
How convenient, Matt.
We'll do this. So basically, you set yourself up in a position where it's going to be neutral. You got to make sure your upper body's nice too.
Right.
Always
all
see
that
this.
good posture.
None of this. All right, and back down, and you keep your
Look at that lumbar
upper
pillow right
torso
there.
straight. Dang, hold on. Look at the lumbar spine too. Okay. Anyways,
Damn it.
so you keep your wrist straight.
Lumbar spine tattoo.
No, it's actually a cervical spine. But
That
anyways,
doesn't
so
make it better.
what you're gonna do, is you do this as many times as possible, and that assesses your wrist extension strength. And yeah, there's a lot of different factors you have to consider, but see how many repetitions you can do. So typically between 3 to 5% body weight, you should be able to do over 40 repetitions to be considered kind of clear to play.
Right.
So
and
use that.
please note that what Matt was doing was he was starting from neutral and not going all the way down into wrist flexion. And also note that everything else about his posture was set well too. So when you're doing this exercise, when you're testing yourself on it, make sure that you have the good setup, and then maybe don't go and play video games immediately afterwards because you have just worn out your arm.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe give it a little rest.
Yes.
That
Usually after you do exercises, your muscles tend to tighten up a little bit if you do a lot. So just a little stretch afterwards. So if you did that wrist extension exercise, just stretch downwards a little bit.
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think I've shown the progression for that for you guys before. Remembering you want to start with wrists down, fingers under, then straighten your elbow if you need to. Yep. Because as with everything
For
else,
us
your
too.
exercises and your structures should be appropriate to the amount that your body can take. For us too? Go ahead.
For us too, we can kind of bias the fingers that we use most. If it's your mouse hand, you can stretch both ways. Just kind of taking your two fingers and then pulling down a little more. And then you can also twist your wrist a little more because that puts a little more tension on the specific slips of muscle fibers that control these guys. And same thing on the way back like this.
Yep.
So you can kind of start here and then extend out like that.
Yep.
So I have a lot of mobility. So.
Join the Hypermobile Club.
Mm-hmm.
If your hands can't do that, don't worry. My hands are weird. You should not necessarily be able to do that. Also,
I have this.
Hickshakers Thumb. Yeah. Hickshakers Thumb Club Unite.
Yes. Go.
And catch your rides. So when it comes to doing stretching, this is slightly off topic from what we're doing on the whole topic tonight. But since we got on the topic, when you're doing your stretches, when you're doing your strengthening, you need to do it within your own capacity. So not forcing your muscles beyond the point that they are prepared for. If you can't do like Matt was saying, the kind of roughly 40 or so of the 3 to 5% of your body weight wrist extensions. That doesn't mean you force yourself to do them all with terrible form. It means you go to what you can and then you stop. And then you say, oh, this is a thing I need to work on. And you do a program
Yep.
to work on it. You build up.
Yep.
Same thing goes
Yep.
for stretching. You don't just immediately haul like this if your hand doesn't want to go there. If this is enough to get you a stretch, great. Stay there. If that's not enough, then you progress a little further.
Yep.
It's all
And
about
in
building
general,
over time.
exactly. And in general, you should feel it in specific places. So when you're doing a wrist extension exercise, you should feel it in the muscles here. You shouldn't feel it in your joint here or down here because you're not using these muscles. And
And if you're feeling
you're
it
not
there,
going to
it
feel
means
it
you're
there.
overcompensating with other muscles that aren't supposed to be doing the work.
That's right.
That means stop.
So, yeah, that means stop, take a look at your posture, reassess a little bit, and try it again, or just rest because you're fatiguing and you're compensating, and you're going
Yep.
to provide a little too much compressive stress into that joint. So just rest a little bit.
Yep. So overall takeaways from tonight: more forces over more time equals more injury risk. It's about striking a balance between what's the most high performance and what's the best ergonomics, accepting the risks and the rewards of both. That you should be working within your capacity, be that in stretching, in strengthening, or in the setup that you're providing yourself with in order to support that ergonomic posture, and that you guys should definitely stay tuned for that series of 4 videos we'll be putting out over the coming months on traditional versus novel peripherals. And Matt, you want to announce next month's topic? Because I know you're pretty excited about it.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Next one topic is going to be more about the exercises relating to posture. So we touched a little bit on about the first month, and then we want to elaborate a little more and give you guys some specific exercises to do that are backed by evidence,
Yeah.
backed by research.
Look at that evidence-based esports thing right there, guys.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know
So
to come back to this eventually.
we want to give you guys actual tools so that you guys can keep playing, keep climbing your those ladders, just get better.
Yep. All right.
Yeah.
So that's it for this month, guys. Thank you very much for tuning in. If you have any questions that we didn't hit, feel free to hit us up on Twitter at Kate McGeePT and at HP for Gamers. Follow the channel if you liked what we had to say. Follow us on Twitter if you want to hear more about what we have to say. Because between the two of us, we are all about playing more and hurting less. And we're out.